Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Today we'll be presenting a topic that we hope you'll find very helpful, titled Tricentis Tosca Best Practices in Action, and discuss how TTC helped one of our Fortune 10 clients improve test execution by an average of 38%. Today we'll be starting with a brief introduction about TTC and Tricentis, followed by an overview of our client's journey from before best practices to the current state, as well as some of the best practices that you can apply as well. And we'll conclude with a brief Q&A. So please be sure to submit any questions that you might have in the chat function, and we'll be sure to address as many as we can within our given time limit. The contents of today's webinar will contain practical tips and best practices for how to improve your test automation. Whether you're someone who's just starting out with Tosca or a more advanced user, we hope everyone can come away with some helpful insights. This experience comes from the knowledge we've gained from Fortune 500 organizations we've worked with over the years. And so just a little bit about our speakers. Colin Mason is a senior manager at TTC and brings over 20 years of experience. He manages a team of over 30 automation specialists and architects utilizing Tricentis Tosca, focused on applications such as SAP, Salesforce, as well as other customer web applications. In addition to Colin, joining will be AJ Driver. AJ is a senior manager at TTC with over 10 years of experience. AJ has extensive experience implementing the Tricentis Tosca tool within Fortune 500 clients that use enterprise platforms such as SAP and others. In addition to the TTC team, we'll be accompanied by Danny Diwali, who is a solution architect with Tricentis. Danny brings over 20 years of software testing experience. We're excited to have Danny with us to provide his own perspective on best practices for continuous testing and test automation. So a little bit about TTC and who we are. TTC was founded in New Zealand in 2004. Today, we've grown to over 300 employees across the globe. We're the leader in software testing and quality assurance with proven methodologies, tools, and templates. Just a little bit about some of our award and certifications over the years. We have worked with CIO reviews, software development times, tools such as Atlassian, Tricentis, Azure DevOps. So we have a lot of subject matter experts who can help with a number of certain areas. And a little bit about what we do. Our primary services include testing as a service, particularly in the areas of enabling test automation, digital transformation, and implementing Agile and DevOps programs, leveraging the latest emerging technologies to help our clients improve their efficiency and reduce overall testing costs. Over the years, we've won numerous awards, including Best Global Implementation of Tricentis Technologies, which is the topic of today's webinar. The perspectives we've gained over the years comes from a number of leading Fortune 500 clients, and we're excited to share them with you today. And with that, I'll be handing off to today's presenters, starting with Danny Diwali, who will be telling us a little bit about Tricentis as well. So take it away, Danny.
Thank you so much. So I'm so glad to be here. Thank you all for joining. And for those of you not so familiar with the history of Tricentis, Tricentis was founded almost 14 years ago. And we have since then acquired over 2,000 clients actually. And we are in the top line of all the verticals of business. As you can see, 8 of the top insurance companies, 7 of the 10 global banks. So we're really well positioned into the companies worldwide, enterprise-wide. We have also acquired and merged with some companies since our start, and we have then included in our portfolio several of our tools that are used today. We have very gladly partnered with TTC, and we're very glad to have TTC as a preferred and partner that has received many awards. We support over 160 partners worldwide, and TTC certainly stands out in the crowd. One thing I want to point out is in terms of analyst recognition, Tricentis has been recognized as the leader as on the test automation for both Gartner, IDC, and Forrester. And just briefly, in terms of tech alliances, we have recently partnered strategically with SAP as the Solex agreement with SAP, where SAP will become not only a customer, and we use Tricentis products and Tosca for its products, but we also include our products, not only Tosca, but also Live Compare and Flood to the SAP solution. So very glad to be here and discuss with you and all the TTC folks on best practices. So take it away, guys.
Thanks, Danny. And starting us off for our client's journey will be Colin Mason.
Thanks, Fong. As Fong mentioned, I am a senior consultant with TTC, and I've been positioned at one of those very large Fortune 500 companies you saw on the screen earlier. Company and the people are wonderful and very skilled and knowledgeable, but luckily for me, there were some opportunities for improvement. I love the challenge, and I love a good challenge. I love being able to be an agent of change. So it was an excellent and exciting adventure for me. I'm going to tell a little story of how how we had some of those challenges and how we overcame them. And then for all the glory details, I'll pass it over to AJ. Do I have control, Fong? Let's see. There we go. So I lead a large team that's responsible for a great many test cases in Tosca, primarily testing SAP applications with a few Salesforce and other applications thrown in. And our team, like we said earlier, is over 30 people, and it's spread over 30 regions, so a few hours of overlap in each region. So they're all the way across the globe. And we were dealing with some very high failure rates, almost exclusively data related. And the chart below shows a little bit of our pain. This is a small snapshot from one particular functional area within an ACP application. For more than 6 months, you can see the failure counts of this one sub-area stay consistently between 30 and 40. This is a long period of time, and this is basically a representation of a team hitting their head against the wall. Not fun at all. So the team was over capacity, dealing with a lot of recurring failures. Life was hard. The workspaces were hard to use with duplicates everywhere, non-standard, folder structures. Execution times are really long. Just an unhappy place, and with no end in sight. So we really didn't have any time. We only had time to really apply quick bandages to stop the bleeding and move on. And we did not have the time to apply any long-term solutions. So this led to some very unhappy customers. A solution with Tosca, right? We've all been in meetings with an angry customer. Right? You're in the room, sheepishly looking down at the floor while the customer paces back and forth, complaining, and that's kind of where we were for a while. And they were also pretty convinced that Tosca wasn't a tool that they were sold on, and it wasn't up to the task. So we really had the job of turning this around, and it was, like I said, it was a fun challenge to do. We also needed more visibility into the workload of the team and its members. Leadership and myself, we really had no visibility into who was doing what, who was overcommitted, and who was carrying a light workload. So we instituted several changes to help us with that. Go to the next slide. All right. So how do we get here? This always sounds pretty horrible. So I'll tell you a little bit how this all sort of came about. Test cases and the projects that came to the department many years ago. So these are 3 years and older applications. In the beginning, there really was no attention made to applying any kind of best practices. It just wasn't something that we considered. We had a lot of, the test cases evolved, the projects evolved, our knowledge of Tosca evolved. We learned a lot of things. We learned what things we should be doing and what things we shouldn't be doing. We still didn't have enough time to go back and pick up all this buildup of technical debt, and it really just amassed into a great deal of confusion and just a big mess. One of the biggest impacts, though, the biggest contributors to this is just a multitude of vendors. We were one. TTC was just one of many, and each one of them had their own agenda, had their own staff, had varying levels of competency within their staff and their own goals and agendas. And I don't want to go into the details, but let's just say that transparency and efficiency weren't high on the priority list. So how did we get out of this hole? Well, one of the nice things that happened was the consolidation down to one vendor. That's us, TTC Global. This was an ancillary benefit. It just naturally occurred, but having one voice in one direction is certainly a nice thing, and it helped us to gain more control over that best practices should be applied and which ones should be applied. We asked AJ, who you'll hear from next. He was tasked with creating a set of best practices customized for this particular environment, and they were published for all to see. He took some time, looked at the Tricentis best practices, looked at how they might be different, they're customized for our particular use cases, and we published a large set of them. We then had to present this to leadership, who agreed right away, and that we should proceed with all haste. Basically, they said, "This is great. When can you start? Let's get busy." So, in order to implement this initiative, I took 3 resources, 3 people, and I allocated them 100% of the time to this effort. This is a big ask since the team was already pretty well overworked. So we pulled them out of the normal regression suite, testing and maintenance, to just do this effort because we knew it was going to pay off over time. And the whole thing really revolved around a goal of making the test cases more maintainable, easier to maintain, more robust, more flexible, less fragile. And it really was amazing how quickly we're able to realize the benefits of this initiative with really profound improvements within just the first 2 weeks. All right, so the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. So we divided the effort into more manageable chunks. It's easier to track the work this way, to track the progress of the work. So they are to implement TDS, which was largely not utilized in our environment at the time. Apply best practices to the objects, assets, and workspaces. Things like ensuring that all the test cases conform to the same naming standard. Folders were standardized and used in a standard way. We removed duplicates and unused stuff. That was the second thing. And the third thing really is to redesign those test cases, do a deep dive on them, and look into those test cases and work with our business process and SMEs to determine things like, is this test case still relevant? Is it still useful? Is there any way we can apply more logic to make it more flexible? Can we make it more self-reliant? Those questions we asked of our SMEs. We utilize more things like the T-box control over whatever the thing is we're using before, but certainly wasn't very efficient. So the T-box control helped us a lot. And using more reusable test step blocks as a couple of examples. Our goal was to create more efficient and meaningful test cases. Aside from the best practice effort, we also wanted to increase collaboration and transparency with what the team was working on to leadership and to our internal customers. So we created a set of wiki pages that helped the customer and ourselves understand and see quickly and clearly what the progress was with each one of these efforts. We're talking about 14 SAP applications, and each one of those has individual sub-functional areas, and an effort is going on in each one of those, and it's going to be difficult to keep track of unless we have a way to really publish and show this. And, also included things like contacts and a project outline, things that were useful from a collaboration standpoint. An additional issue that the team faced was that leadership and myself had no, when I came on board, had no visibility into the work. So I looked at the work that was being done. It's a maintenance and support team, and so most of the work is is unplanned work. So Kanban is the best fit for a set of unplanned, mostly unplanned work. But with this new maintainability effort, there's a lot of new development going on. So it really kind of turned out to be more of a Scrum-Bond approach, but it certainly allowed myself and our leadership to be able to see the work that was being done, which was a huge improvement. It was basically in a big vacuum before. So, like I saw earlier, improvements were realized almost immediately. It was just a few weeks we were able to see some pretty big improvements. Those unhappy customers that I told you about, we had 2 months. I'm sorry, these were monthly meetings with these folks. Had 2 very uncomfortable meetings, and that third monthly meeting was filled with high praise and elation. And it only got better from there. They were so pleased with the work that we had done and so happy with the tool. They really became big fans of the team, the benefits of the work that we were doing, and fans of Tosca. They began to realize that Tosca really can do this work and do it reliably. So it was very happy. I was very happy to see the huge transformation from worst enemy to biggest fan. The team itself, they were overutilized, they were stressed, they were banging their head against the wall. They really became a happy team with extra capacity to handle the transition of additional test cases. The more and more test cases come into the testing to the maintenance and support team over time, and we also have to deal with events such as SPUs, the SAP service pack upgrades, which with 14 SAP applications, we're pretty much doing an SPU all year round for something. And adding that additional work was a real struggle for the team. Now we have additional bandwidth to handle those, handle them pretty smoothly. So far, estimate that we've saved about 4 FTEs in man. I mean, we only just got started, so I think we've got a long way to go, and we're going to save a lot more time. Slides change so slowly. So here's some pretty pictures to look at. This is the same chart that you saw earlier, only I've added a detailed view of some of the improvements, the time frame of the improvements we've made. The red box shows is just down here, is shown in detail in the chart below, and you can see there was this copy back event which we're working to improve as well. But aside from that, you see where the start of the best practice implementation happened somewhere around March of 2020, and quickly into April we broke through that 30 test case failure line that we were hovering over, and it just went down and down from there. Just kept falling and falling. So we even hit 0 for a couple of weeks, and today we were normally routinely doing 30 to 40 failures, dealing with 30 to 40 failures a week. Now it's almost an emergency when we get 5. So you can understand that reducing all these false negatives, reducing all that noise, it's just distracting. It's hard to pick out where your true defects are when you've got mounds and mounds of failures to sort through to see which ones are the real ones and which ones are the false ones. So this allows you to have much more clarity into the health of your project. So just not able to looking for a needle in a haystack, but really easy to go through the results. It was a huge dramatic, and this is just one application. So I'll spend a little time looking at some graphs illustrating some improvements that we've made over like the amount of clutter and waste we have and the better utilization of assets. And these are some Tableau reports that AJ helped us develop. And I'll go through 3 or 4 of these. These are execution entries, and you can see around May the 1st, we really went off a cliff, right? We have unused execution entries, pretty big amount of them. We're able to actually reduce the number of unused execution entries. And also, I think we also, looks like we noticed a whole lot of extra fluff in our execution entry. We're able to delete a whole bunch that were being used, but were unnecessarily being used. Look at the test sheets. We had over 200 unused test sheets in the beginning, and whittled that down to almost nothing. I'm running a pretty lean ship right now with the unused test sheets, only at 17. One too many. I can't go back. Oh, and go back. Back. Okay. Modules, again, very lean. We're down to 90 unused modules. This graph is in the thousands, right? So this is a significant number of modules that were removed from the workspace. And so those were examples of clutter. Here's an example of how we actually utilize more assets. Reusable test step blocks. We had a pretty significant number of fluff there. We reduced them down to a very low number of unused test step reusable test step blocks, but now that usage is climbing. We're utilizing them in more places. The lean mean machine. Pong, I'm not sure if you're advancing the slides or if I am, but it's so slow if I'm doing it. So here is our reduced execution time chart. This is a snapshot of 13 test cases that I just picked at random from one particular functional area. The execution times before these best practices were applied was 27 hours for these 13 test cases. After those, after all the 3 elements were applied, the TDS, the best practices, and the redesign, we were able to bring that down to 17 hours, save 10 hours of execution time just with the 13 test cases. I was able to, the highest I've been able to find in the data was a 75% reduction in time, but on average, it's about 38% in the reduction of execution time. Sometimes there's actually an increase, but that's pretty rare. But sometimes when we're looking at redesigning the test cases, we do actually add some time to some of them. But this is just with 13 test cases. If you look at this particular application had 450 test cases. When we're finished with this application, that time savings is going to be massive. So we're actually able to optimize our usage of DEX and place these executions in a much more optimized way. The paragraph before, AJ can go into more details about how we did this, but minimize use of static weights and loops and some of the other things. The T-box windows, great to help with this. All right. I think Fong and I are competing. And here's just an elongated graph of those 13 test cases that let you see the dramatic improvements in some of their times. The orange is the before, the blue is the after. In almost all cases, there was some significant changes. Test case 5 is an example of one that actually increased its execution time, but you can see just by a little bit. But for the most part, we got some pretty dramatic changes. So really, that's the story of how we went from a real troubled area we sort of inherited a mess, and we're able to transform it just by the application of good, sound set of best practices. That's just the story of how we did it from a leadership perspective. Now I'll pass it over to AJ if he'll go into some more of the deep dive details. AJ, take it away.
All right, thank you, Colin. So what we're going to cover are some of the things that you can apply, some which I'm sure that you may have already or may already be aware of, but we'll just get into it. So the first one is an obvious one: avoid static weights. And for this one, it's obviously taking your system behavior, or the speed at which your system is responding, into account. And using a static weight is a brittle way of dealing with that variance. So how long do you wait for? It's really going to be a number of factors. And the best way to wait for your system to respond is to use dynamic weights. Combined with sort of dynamic weights is establishing a place or a state. So before you navigate or start inputting information into the application and the test, it's making sure that you know where you are and the system is in a state that you can proceed with confidence. And the way that this kind of works is, or at least what it helps you to do, is it's going to reduce the issues that you may see in terms of expecting a certain state before proceeding and then your execution failing. And it makes that troubleshooting of failures easier because you're not finding, or you're not having steps performed subsequent to where the failure actually occurred, and you're isolating down to where the issue is. So in that little graphic there, this specific step, if it's waiting on a specific vendor and vendor long description to populate, and it took this system anywhere sort of from 2 to 10 seconds for this to populate. And until it had populated, there's no real way to proceed. So just waiting on that value to actually populate allows you to determine that the action actually occurred. Making test cases self-contained. This is something which oftentimes is sort of a pursuit of efficiency. So for instance, splitting out a login and having that at the beginning of an execution list, or daisy chaining different test cases together within an execution list, which ultimately creates implicit dependencies between the test cases and can result in cascading failures within the execution lists. So that makes it difficult for anyone to look at a test case within Tosca and understand that that test case is self-contained in terms of it has all the steps that it needs to run by itself. And if you don't have your test cases developed this way, you have to have a way of capturing those implicit dependencies. What's more, recovery scenarios, they don't work across test cases within an execution list. They just work for an individual test case. And finally, if you're looking at upgrading, if you've already upgraded to a more recent version of Tosca, there's no way to use AOS in your execution of your test cases in an execution list. So that gives you the ability to hand out individual execution entries in an execution list to different agents rather than having them all run in serial. And if you have this interdependency between your test cases, you obviously can't do that, and that would require re-architecting of your test cases to enable you to leverage AOS and gain that efficiency in execution. And this was a big one for us in regards to the data issues that we're seeing. And for SAP, this is a perennial kind of an issue, where it's hard to sort of stage data necessarily into SAP systems, and there's effort which has to go into coming up with a strategy to deal with that. And so we identified things that would help us, and then went about making sure that that was a standard part of our approach to how we were developing our test cases. And a large part of that was utilizing TDS and making sure that at the beginning of our test cases within our preconditions, it was doing whatever, or the test cases were doing whatever they needed to do to either stage or retrieve test data or groom data within the environment for the test case to successfully pass. Along with that, resetting data if possible, taking it back to the state where it was prior to it being utilized. That's obviously a good practice as well. But for the purposes of some of the data that was being consumed just through the nature of working through a specific business process or what have you, having data characterized and abstracted into TDS where it could be retrieved, that helped us remove some of the data dependencies which were being hard-coded into the TCD test sheets, such that we could say this type of data we're going to use to satisfy this condition for this particular business process. Now, develop what you need, delete what you don't. This is kind of a funny thing to say, which you might not think you'd need to say. And it comes down to, at least for test cases, identifying the right tests to automate in the first place. And this is a topic in and of itself, which we're not going to cover in this particular webinar. But how this manifests itself in Tosca, oftentimes it can occur within modules in terms of the attributes which are captured, and especially in SAP, which is a very object-heavy application. Screens are very busy. What we were finding were users who are not that experienced with either SAP or the business processes which they were attempting to automate were taking their grab everything that they could see. And at least for modules, if you're spending time developing them correctly, you're making sure that all of the attributes actually work properly. And for the development effort, there's a lot of time spent on developing attributes which ultimately were never used. And there's a related issue here in that over time, your application is going to change, and things which were captured previously but not used, only to maybe potentially be utilized later, they have changed, and there's no maintenance or upkeep of those objects which haven't been used. So that was a big issue. I think this, at least for module attributes within modules, is quite a common, not an issue, but a common occurrence. And for other things, we're seeing duplicated test cases, duplicated execution entries, really the whole swathe. So part of that, I think, is really all users misunderstanding the object hierarchy of how things are referenced within Tosca itself. And so it's incumbent upon us to help educate everyone that make sure that you're using what's available rather than creating something new, and then shifting the expectation a little bit around how development should occur in the first place. And also, cleaning up after yourself is really cannot sort of be overstated. We are finding test cases that were being used for development purposes being left over. Really, a lot of stuff just left in the repo or in the repos. So anyone coming into the repo and attempting to do any kind of maintenance after that is really an involved process in trying to determine what was actually needed, and and what could be updated. So, a good example would be a test case had been duplicated and both had been executed in execution entries. But which one is the one to keep? And you could take the one which was executed most recently, but it requires you to go and talk to someone to find out what is the most valid, what is the valid instance of that test case, or a reusable test set block, which may be a duplicate used in test cases, referenced in test cases, but none of those test cases having ever been executed. So technically that block is used but redundant. So there's a lot of a cleanup involved in getting rid of things that were not required, to make sure that when it came time to perform maintenance, we're really only looking at those objects which we needed to maintain, which made that effort less. This was also a big one, ensuring everyone owns quality. So we had a pretty sort of a standard setup in terms of architects and specialists, and architects were the quality gates of the work that was being done by the specialists. But that was sort of we were finding that it was the wrong kind of a place to actually review for quality. So it was happening at the end once development was quote unquote done by the specialists. And so we really went through and codified a series of conventions. Here below you can see some of the conventions that we applied to our test cases, but we had them for modules and blocks as well. And then through the utilization of virtual folders, we were able to centralize that kind of a review process. So a good one would be, we're expecting that test cases had to have an execution entry with at least, or the 3 most recent passing logs had to be on DEX. And that's really obviously just to establish stability for the test cases in execution. But rather than right-clicking on the test case and jumping off to see where there are execution logs and what the logs look like, to make sure that there's a good stable history of execution, it's all centralized. So it makes that review easier. And by pushing that ownership of quality down the expectations on what people are doing, we sort of moved away from an architect review at the end to having teams and users maintain the quality themselves, own that quality themselves. And the kind of review that would be done up front now, or the review process, oftentimes it's more of a design, an active design, and looking at an application when it's coming on board to say, how are we going to develop the modules for this? What's the folder structure going to look like? And what are our expectations for this specific application? So that was a big shift, and one which was very beneficial. In terms of actual execution time, I'd say beware of bad conditions in conditional statements. And as a rule, conditional statements should be avoided. We want to make sure that our conditions are explicit in terms of we characterize the attributes of our application which drive functional difference within our applications or systems under test. And then when we link those test data sheets to our test case templates, that's actually driving the instantiation of explicit scenarios or test cases which are validating specific behavior. This is not always possible, and this is quite true in SAP. And where this was tripping us up was we had these bad conditions. So in our launch and login block for SAP GUI, there were 4 conditions on which we were waiting, and that was different pop-ups, different modules that could be displayed at login time. And the way that they were structured, it was the module of the module that we were waiting on, or at least an object within that module which we're waiting on, which we would then accept if it was existent. The big issue here is the synchronization settings that we had. They're set to 60 seconds for the most part, just because the system generally can take up to 60 seconds to perform certain actions. So that's what they were set up as. But given that it was waiting 60 seconds for each modal, we were finding that oftentimes it was anywhere from 2 minutes to 4 minutes that it was taking to log in. So this is one of the first things I noticed when I started doing this analysis. And for 2,500 odd test cases, which are mostly logging into SAP, that really quickly added up in terms of wasted time, where every time a scenario was attempting to log in, it was just waiting, and for no good reason. So we're able to change that and given that it's hooked into the SAP process, we're using T-box window operation to verify if the modal existed. And it went from 2 minutes to 4 minutes in terms of it logging into SAP, down to 20 seconds consistently from the point where the application was launched and we had landed on the the home screen. So that's specific to a specific instance with the SAP login, but really these bad conditions were in a lot of places, and there was a lot of redundant waiting happening, which cut down, once these were addressed, cut down execution time significantly. And I think, if you've got what looks like a test case which executes for 8 minutes, and really 4 of those minutes are just wasted time, it's really easy to save time addressing these kinds of bad conditions. Use recovery scenarios wisely. This one, recovery scenarios are really a rabbit hole that you can fall down. And the approach that we'd recommend is always just to keep them as simple as possible. You can maybe tailor them a little bit more so if you embed them into your templates, and if certain data conditions drive certain actions throughout a test case instance, then you can have specific cleanup scenarios, or specific steps to do specific actions within a cleanup scenario. But that's really the extent to where we'd sort of look to go with the complexity of our cleanup scenarios, and to a certain degree the recovery scenarios. It's always best to keep them as simple as possible. And for us to be able to judge what was really effective, I'd recommend that you review the efficacy of your executions periodically. And for us, that was, I looked at a period of basically a year. It was all of last year. And for those executions which attempted recovery, which are 40,000 odd executions, only 6% went on to pass. So that's a very, very small number of test cases or executions which have gone on to pass, where the recovery scenarios have not changed the outcome whatsoever. So the additional time where the scenarios, recovery scenarios, were attempting to do something and failing were significant. And also at a retry level, if your test case retry level is set to, if the retry level is set to test case, your execution entry actually only reports the time with which it restarts the attempt. So if you have one retry at the test case level and your test case takes sort of 5 minutes to run and it fails at the 4th minute, it's going to run once, fail at the 4th minute. If the recovery scenario is set up correctly, it'll close down the application, restart the execution, and your log is only going to report 4 minutes of execution time versus the 8 that it's actually taken. So recovery scenarios are important to use. Recovery and cleanup scenarios are important to use, but use them judiciously and make sure that it's always as simple as possible. Now, the repository folder structure, this is I think really sort of a common in-work review completed subfolder structure for your different types of objects within Tosca. At least for our user base, which by this point in time we're well versed with Tosca, what we were finding was that it really increased the amount of duplication that we were seeing, and simultaneously, because the completed folder was locked to architects, objects weren't necessarily moving from either in-work into review or review into completed, simply because change was being introduced on a frequent enough basis that, and given the geographic spread of the teams, if something was in the completed folder, a modular test case, there was a delay in terms of getting that object out of a completed folder into a state where it could be updated to be re-completed. And by moving to a sort of a end state for the folder structure, so coming up with a logical representation for an application within the modules folder, we've been able to reduce the amount of duplication that was occurring. People were just having the same modules in their own in-work folders, and there might also be the same module in the review folder, and there might even be the same module in the completed folder. So that was something which was causing us difficulties, and we had gotten to a point in maturity where we reviewed the structure to say, what purpose is this serving? If it's supposed to ensure quality is being achieved, at this point it's not really doing that for us. So we moved away from that structure to this structure, and that's really helped us as well. And finally, to achieve a 35 or 38% reduction in execution time, there's no one thing that was done. There's plenty on the process side, plenty within Tosca itself, and really getting insight into what the state of the repositories were to be able to make a cumulative effort of attacking what the problems were and addressing them. So this, you may not see this kind of a result yourselves, depending on the application that you're working with in the first place. But at least for our client, it was a really big win. A lot of time waiting for execution results to come back was simply just wasted dead time, that we weren't either improving the outcome of the results, or we were waiting extraneously for things that were never going to pass, or were never going to get to a finished state because of a multitude of things. The biggest win, I think, for us out of this, though, was boosting the ownership of quality and lowering the development barriers. That's, as Colin mentioned, really empowered the team and given them the ability to make change, create development, or do development at speed, which was previously also somewhat slow. So that was a significant win for the team, and I think probably more important than that reduction in time. All right, thank you very much. Hope some of that is helpful.